So let's talk about the decades in review. So when we looked at and did a comparison of the last decades, let's say from 1980 from 1980 to 1989, and then we did 1990 to 1999 and so on, the 2000s, 2010s, and then what the future has to hold for the 2020s. In the 1980s, we saw that Japan happened to have been the long bull sector of the market at that point. And what we also saw is that many investors at that point in time went into things like the tiger funds, if you remember back then.
That's right.
And that was the trend. Then we had in the 90s, it was US large cap. And then we saw that if you saw the trend of cash flows, a lot of cash flows that investors had went into the S&P type investments. And at the time it was also the NASDAQ. Remember the bull of the NASDAQ. Then you have the 2000s. And so the 2000s happened to have been emerging markets. And although for many people they had it as a piece of their portfolio, not quite sure if they really took advantage of the upswing of that. So then we had 2010s. And in 2010s, what we saw the US
leading the way. Yes.
And so what's the bias that you're hearing about or seeing now when it comes to the markets?
Well, from this slide that we did the research among all the different market sectors, one thing we can point out is the importance of the diversified portfolio, because no one can predict which particular market sector will outperform in the future. That's why we don't want to be in a single market like only in the US, but we also have wanting to participate the international market along the way to making sure that we have full growth power with a diversified into different market sectors.
And we spent a lot of time in the investment committee discussing this, because what happens is there's something called recency bias that investors tend to focus on. So the recency bias that we saw in the 1980s, for example, was that movement of investments into Japan after they already saw a trend of increase in Japan. We're seeing that today, where there's a number of investors that are moving towards buying more into the US. Not saying that it's wrong, not that it's saying that we should be getting out of it, but they're kind of foregoing the diversification that they should be maintaining within the portfolio and overweighting themselves just purely into the sector. And that's a recency bias, because they're seeing that long trend of a number of years that the S&P happens to be one of the better performing segments of the markets as a whole. And then we have the 2020s, and we just started, so we don't know really what's going to happen there.